National Red Message for Mothers. But
I was going to say, I
started and we've been there for almost 3 years. And we're not going anywhere.
Yes. So I'll see if I can find yeah. Yeah. But you know, it's exactly right.
Buenos dias, good morning. Buenos dias, good morning. Bonjour. Before you do anything else, get the event app. I was told, push the event app. Get the event app. It's eventmobi.com/Red Cross Conference. Then you can ask your questions. First question. This is awesome. Okay. You're not paying attention. All right. My name is Armando Trull. I'm a senior reporter with WAMU Radio. It's the NPR station here in Washington. And I have been covering immigration issues for the last 22 years. So I know a little bit about this, probably less than many of you here who are experts and have been toiling in the front lines of issues such as migration. This, as you know, the Humanitarian Action Across Borders, Migration in the Americas Conference, truly is, I'm happy to be speaking here. I self-invited myself to do this because I think this is an important issue that all of you are undertaking, that all of us are undertaking. I think migration is something that has been with us for decades, if not centuries, in this country and all around the world. And I think it is important that in this country, we become more aware of migration, its causes, and how to alleviate them, and how to make migrants and the lives of migrants, how to make them better, whether they're in their country or whether they're on their journey or whether they arrive at whatever destination. So, having said that, I would like to introduce the two opening remark speakers. Harold Brooks, he's the Senior Vice President of International Operations, and Francios, Stamm, Head of Delegation of the ICRC in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen.
Hey folks, hello and welcome. Let me first of all say that it's a real thrill to have Armando here. I get corny and say Armando Trull is really cool. You
Say it again.
You hear him in the morning and you pay attention. A, because he's got this amazing voice, and B, he's bringing a lot of great information. So Armando, thanks so much for being here. Really a big fan of yours for the right and good reasons. We at the American Red Cross are humbled to be the host for this event. We're relatively newcomers to this, and we have so much that we intend to and hope to learn from each and every one of you. So be prepared to get into a great exchange where we can teach and learn and teach from each other during the course of this time. It's so very exciting. I have always had an interest in restoring family links and the area of migration, but I went from being interested and supportive to being on fire for this matter when I spent some time in Nogales recently. Went along with Kathleen and Nadia, and it was sobering. We got down there, and Vicente, I think you'll see later, and also Alicia Maish, who is probably my new love, because this woman is so devoted to this wonderful hard work. And to see these unaccompanied children who come across the border, for instance, and to see the work being done by a collaborative, Red Cross and other organizations, is just very heartwarming. It's the kind of thing that is magical. An organization called No Mas Muertas, for instance, is doing stuff that probably is a little under the radar and probably a little bit off the books of legality, but man, we are so proud to be partnering with them, providing cell phones so that people can make that call. You know, coyotes are pretty vicious folks, and you know they have these people out in these compromising situations where they've already taken money from the families, and when the folks get detained, if they're not able to call home or call someone and say, hey, we're okay, the coyotes will call the families and extort them for even more money. Say, well, they've been kidnapped. The only way we're going to get them back is if. So we're so proud to be providing these cell phones so that people can make those calls. And it's a small thing, but it's a really, really important thing. And again, the fabric of this world that we are learning about and hoping to get better at in providing service to people in the area of migration in the Americas, really globally, is something that we hope to learn a lot, exchange a lot, and get better at all the time. So I will turn this over to a dear, dear friend of mine who he runs the International Committee of Red Cross here in Washington, D.C. He covers the Americas. He's just a wonderful, wonderful man. We're always conspiring to see if there are bigger, better ways that we can serve humanity. So please join me in saying a warm welcome to Francios.
Thank you, Harold. I just covered the US and Canada, just to be clear, which is big enough for me. Thank you very much, and I would like to commend the American Red Cross for organizing this very important event, and we're very pleased and honored to be associated to it. Yes, my name is Francois. I've been here in Washington for 2.5 years now, running the ICRC delegation for the US and Canada, but now with growing links to our delegations in Mexico and Central America, especially on the issue of migration.
You have to speak more at that mic.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Thanks. When you think of the International Committee of the Red Cross, chances are the word migration doesn't automatically spring to mind. Perhaps you think of Guantanamo, Afghanistan, or Syria. Or maybe you think of the Geneva Conventions and armed conflict. And all those things are correct. But I hope to convince you that when you think of the ICRC and the broader international Red Cross and Red Crescent movement in general, you should think about migration, especially when it comes to the most vulnerable, such as children and detainees. You see, it's our job to protect and help civilians. And as part of a truly global movement present in 189 countries, the Red Cross and Red Crescent is uniquely positioned to come up with diverse, dynamic, and creative solutions to migration-related problems. From Libya to Italy, from Lebanon to Jordan, from Honduras to the United States, and beyond, migration is a transnational issue involving around 230 million people, including more than 70 million who have been forced to flee their countries against their will due to conflict, violence, repression, persecution, natural disasters, environmental degradation, poverty, poor governance, just to name a few reasons. Let me say that number again. 70 million people forced to flee their home countries. That's more than the entire population of France or the UK. More than the populations of California and Texas combined. People forced to leave their possessions behind, separated from loved ones, threatened by human trafficking, extortion, or sexual abuse. Each year, hundreds of thousands from Central America risk life and limb riding atop dangerous rail cars on what is known as La Bestia, or the beast, trying to reach the US. In Africa, you can find up to 300 migrants packed onto a single truck at a time, passing through Niger on a 600-mile journey across the desert in sweltering heat. At the passport center in Sana, you can find a baby crawling on the dusty floor, too little to understand his situation, too young to share in his mother's despair as she awaits the deportation from Yemen to Ethiopia. They are floating in the middle of the Mediterranean or the Indian Ocean, stuffed into shipping containers and aboard leaky vessels bound for rough shores. You can find them behind bars and in holding centers around the world, the undocumented, the irregular, the unwanted, the illegal. These are the most vulnerable migrants and those whom the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement pledged back in 2007 to help. Our focus is on addressing the needs of their families, and we offer our help regardless of a person's legal status. As political and polarizing as it can be, as with other issues, we don't take sides on migration. We accept that it's a growing reality in a world where the gap between rich and poor is widening, armed conflicts are becoming more protracted and complex, urban violence is spreading, and there is no shortage to the inequality and disparity that drive some people from their homes in search of a better life, and in some cases simply another life, in a place where they are not threatened and where they can live in peace with their families. What the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement does for vulnerable migrants varies from one place to another, depending on their needs, the situation in their home countries, and the challenges they face along their journey. For example, the ICRC works closely with the Red Cross societies of Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras to help migrants along the route from Central to North America, provide drinking water, help them contact their relatives, and assist those with injuries or who have lost an arm or a leg on their treacherous train ride aboard La Bestia. Local Red Cross societies also run basic healthcare facilities. From January to August of last year alone, almost 19,000 migrants received aid at Red Cross and ICRC assistance points in Mexico. In Honduras, around 17,000 received hygiene items like soap, plus food for unaccompanied children and transportation. The ICRC also has a special role to play in favor of detained migrants. Over the past few years, the detention of migrants as a result of their immigration status has indeed become a major concern of ours. Undocumented or irregular migrants are often detained along the journey or when they reach their destination. Many governments have taken to using detention as a tool to curb the flow of people over their borders. These migrants can wind up spending months or even years behind bars or locked up in centers while awaiting deportation. This uncertainty causes very real anguish, often compounding other types of trauma a migrant may have experienced. The ICRC witnesses the negative impact of administrative detention during our visits to holding centers, and we are particularly concerned about the risk of indefinite detention. So we stress upon authorities that people in detention must be treated with dignity and held in decent conditions. And in cases of administrative detention, conditions must be non-punitive. For example, even if a facility is closed off, migrants should be able to move freely within its walls. And we advocate that migrants should be able to maintain contact with the outside world, in particular with their families. You know, the need for contact, the need to know where your loved one is. It's something we take for granted. But time and again, what you discover as someone who works for the Red Cross is that it is perhaps the most basic and fundamental need that people have. Before they want a drink of water or anything to eat, before they want a blanket or a roof over their heads, they want to know, is my son okay? Is my daughter safe? Is my husband alive? Did my wife make it out? And it is to answer these questions that, in addition to all of the other activities I just described, one of the most important things the Red Cross and Red Crescent does for migrants to help is help reconnect them with their families through calling centers, Red Cross messages, and the internet. That's also why we provide forensic support and expertise in cases of migrants who have died or gone missing along the way. The International Organization for Migration says more than 40,000 migrants have died worldwide since 2000, including 6,000 along the US-Mexico border. That's a lot of families left without answers. So we've also started pilot projects to support them in overcoming the difficulties linked to the disappearance of a loved one. And finally, we monitor the humanitarian consequences of deportation while monitoring conditions of repatriation. To say that the issues surrounding vulnerable migrants are complex is an understatement. There are no easy answers, as all of you in this room know too well. Many of you represent organizations that have been grappling with these issues far longer than we have, and whose expertise and knowledge are unparalleled. But if we are here today, it's because we all recognize that no single organization or government agency can tackle these problems on their own. We each have an important role to play. So, as I said in the beginning of my talk, when you think of migrants, especially vulnerable ones, I hope you think of the ICRC and the broader Red Cross Red Crescent movement, and that moving forward, we can work together to come up with solutions to these seemingly intractable problems. Because we must do more than talk, we must act. As humanitarians, we owe it to this little boy, the young girl, the frightened mother, or the desperate father who, during the time it took me to give this short speech, set off on a dangerous and unpredictable journey towards the unknown. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you, Francois. One thing I neglected to mention, turn off your phone. Does anyone have any questions for Harold?
So we'd like to present Francois. So I just want to say thank you very much for joining us and for giving that beautiful overview of the Red Cross work for migrants. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Also, in recognition of the fact that we have another movement partner with us from the Federation, Mr. Luis Luna.
And the two. So does anyone have any questions for Francois or for Harold? Well, I would like to ask a question. I am curious as to what was the motivation for holding this conference.
That's a Nadia question.
Throw her right under the bus. Nadia.
Let me, if I may. The leadership of Kathleen, who just came up and presented the ties to a couple of people, Francois, and also Luis Luna, who's one of my heroes. First met him in Haiti, and he was kind of the chief diplomat for the Red Cross movement. And this man is magical. So I am so honored that he is here with us today. I just got to tell you that. And, the impetus of this, the getting smarter at this, comes as a result of this very singular force known as Nadia. So Nadia, come up here and answer that question. And join me in giving her a hand, because she's amazing. Yeah.
Well, it's actually quite simple. The fact is that you all know so much. This room contains so much knowledge, and there are so many great needs. The Red Cross has a unique role to convene people when necessary. And I think that in our role of impartiality and neutrality, we hold that role very, very sacred to crises like these. And so I think that at this moment, we have an opportunity to bring all the knowledge that we have together and really, again, I'm humbled by the knowledge in this room and the work that's been done for many, many years. And on the work that's being done and create the networks that are needed.
Perfect. All right.
Francois has to depart, so
Yes, I'm sorry.
thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Francois, we give you a tie and then you leave.
Good deal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we are right on time, and I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Victoria Rietig. She is a policy analyst, international program and coordinator of the Regional Migration Study Group. the Migration Policy Institute. She has done extensive work on migration, forced migration. She has done work in Mexico. Victoria, bienvenida. Come on up.
Well, thank you very much, Armando, for this kind introduction. And let me join Francois and Harold in starting out by saying what a pleasure and really what an honor it is to be here and join you here today. It is a pleasure because I'm glad to support the Conference of the American Red Cross, an organization driven by volunteers whose provision of humanitarian services, countless services, and disaster relief really makes a difference not just in the United States, but beyond the borders. I also have to say that I find myself consistently impressed with conversations with members of the American Red Cross and of other national chapters, and also with ICRC members. And I'm impressed usually not just with their knowledge, but with the passion with which they approach their work. Equally, I have to say that it is an honor to speak at a conference that has gathered panelists of such an extraordinary standing and with experience that, frankly speaking, exceeds my own by decades. So their work, the work that they do, the reports they write, inform our work at the Migration Policy Institute. And some of you I have met, Leslie Velez from UNHCR, who will be on the first panel and should be somewhere in this room, Mark Lynn from the ICRC. And I know that many of the organizations here today also have institutional links to MPI, Kind, Kids in the Defense, the Women's Refugee Commission. Just tell me when it's been awful.
We want to hear you.
So I look forward to the discussions and to listen to your thoughts and really to learn from your experiences. Now, I've been asked to speak about global and regional migration trends. And I would like to highlight 3 trends that are of particular interest for the Americas and thereby for all of us in this room. After that, I need the little clicker. Thank you. That was just very nice. So the first trend I would like to speak about is the global growth of asylum seekers and the challenges that they present us with. The second trend is the struggle to balance protection and enforcement in the face of increasingly mixed migration flows. And third, Mexico's new role as a regional migration manager. I should add that I owe great thanks to my colleagues Kathleen Newland and Mark Rosenblum at the Migration Policy Institutes. They're 2 of our experts on asylum policies and on US immigration policies, and conversations with them have greatly informed my remarks. So I've stolen a few years of experience from them, so to speak. So let us look at the first trend. The number of asylum seekers worldwide is growing. Now, those of you that follow the work of the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, may know that they regularly report asylum trends in 44 industrialized countries, most of them in Europe, but also including the US, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. And recent reports find that the number of asylum seekers in these major receiving countries increased by nearly 13% between 2012 and 2013. Within only 1 year, the total number of asylum seekers grew by more than 100,000, which is 612,000 people in 2013. This chart here visualizes the growth of monthly asylum claims since 2011 in these industrialized countries. So we see that 30,000 claims lodged in January of 2011, here this dark green line, had doubled by October 2013, the purple line. And the slope of the blue line right above shows that this growth continued in 2014. Now, 6 months ago, some of you may remember, the High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, made headlines when he announced a quantum leap in forced displacement in the world, after his agency found that the total number of forcibly displaced people worldwide had exceeded 50 million And that number includes roughly 33 million internally displaced people, about 16 million refugees, and 1 million asylum seekers. A leveling off of this trend is not expected in the near future. Now, allow me a quick comment on the differentiation between refugees and asylum seekers. As many of you know, the term refugee refers to a person who has left his or her home countries because of persecution or fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. You can become a refugee in two ways, either by filing an individual's claim or by being part of a larger group of people who have fled conditions in their home country and thereby are recognized as prima facie refugees. In contrast, an asylum seeker is someone who says he or she is a refugee, but whose individual claim has not yet been decided. So my comments focus largely on the latter, asylum seekers. So what are reasons for the global growth that we see here of asylum seekers? Reasons are pretty obvious when we look at the top countries of origin of asylum seekers, many of which are torn by war, civil war, and violence. Syria leads this undesirable list, followed by Iraq and Afghanistan. After 3 years of civil war, there are more than 3.3 million refugees from Syria, most of them living in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. Now, these are mostly prima facie refugees, but in addition to those, there are also growing numbers of Syrian asylum seekers. So where exactly do Syrians, Iraqis, and Afghans go when they have to leave their countries? Where do they go and seek asylum? So these colored dots here tell us a story. In general, people seek asylum close to home, but if they decide to leave their immediate neighborhood, let's look at the colored dots. Because it is a great story. Does that work?
People cure when he does that.
Does that make sense?
No.
Colored dots? How's this?
Yeah.
So coming back to the dots. So you see here that in general, people seek asylum close to home, but if they decide to leave their immediate neighborhood, then their main destination is Europe. And here you see the location of asylee populations from Syria. We've exchanged one technical item. Afghanistan. And Iraq. The largest single recipient country of new asylum claims worldwide is Germany. In 2013, 110,000 claims were lodged in Germany, compared to about 90,000 here in the United States. And that was followed by France and Sweden. So there are exceptions to this rule of asylum seeking close to home, and the United States is one of them. Press headlines in the US may focus on asylum seekers from neighboring countries of Mexico and Central America. But the country from which most asylum claims in the US originated last year was in fact China. So this is not a new trend. Chinese asylum seekers in the US have traditionally had high chances of approval due to China's one-child policy and also governmental oppression of political beliefs and of ethnic and religious minorities. Mexico, as you can see here, ranks second with about 9,000 asylum claims in 2013, which is around 25% less than China. And to give you a sense, overall, asylum claims to the US have grown by about 25% each in 2013 and again in 2014. Now, what do we take from this? Comparing the situations in the United States and Europe, an important fact to remember is that while the functioning of the country's asylum systems are different, the challenges they face are remarkably similar. So growing numbers of asylees and refugees mean also a growing need for short-term reception and long-term reintegration services. Urgent spikes in arrivals require urgent buildup of legal, medical, and psychological services. And therefore, we may have all followed the discussions about higher budgets for courts, for lawyers, judges, doctors, psychologists, and for social workers. On both sides of the Atlantic, policymakers concerned with asylum and migration policies therefore ask similar questions. They ask, how can we ensure appropriate and humane treatment of new arrivals? What are adequate housing arrangements? And to which degree should detention be an option? Something Francois mentioned earlier. How can we ensure a speedy yet simultaneously fair and consistent way of adjudicating asylum claims? And how can the burden of providing reception and integration services be shared between federal, state, and local governments, and in Europe's case, among European Union member states? Now, at their core, all of these questions are about balancing the need of asylum seekers with the realistic capabilities of recipient countries. And that is what brings me to my second trend.
Up here more towards the computer.
Second trend, which is that countries around the world are struggling to balance protection and enforcement concerns in their migration and asylum policies. Now, the first reaction may be, well, balancing enforcement and protection, that is not a new trend. And you're right, of course. But as migration flows are becoming increasingly mixed, with migrants seeking jobs entering next to those seeking humanitarian protection, and with 17-year-olds invoking different rules than 18-year-olds, the struggle for a balanced response has dominated actions from the Rio Grande Valley all the way to the shores of the Mediterranean. Now, let me state clearly that enforcement and protection are both legitimate concerns of functioning migration policies. Protection of vulnerable populations, whether they are applicants for asylum or for other types of relief, is a legal and a moral imperative. A legal imperative because international and national law stipulates protection of certain vulnerable populations. For instance, the United Nations 1951 Refugee Convention and its 67 Protocol, that the majority of the world's countries, including most Western countries, are bound by. In the United States, the 1980s Refugee Act describes how the country should implement these provisions for refugees and asylum seekers. But it is also a moral imperative, because the protection of human rights is a value held dear, or at least aspired to, by many governments around the globe. On the other hand, the right to control its own borders is a fundamental right of any sovereign state. Every state can shape its migration policies to lay down the rules about who is granted entry into a country and to whom this privilege is denied. Within the constraints imposed by human rights treaties, every country is free to pick and choose who to admit and who to reject. And that is not a controversial statement. We may not like the rules that are laid down and might perceive them as too strict or too benign, but enforcement of migration policies and border control are principles agreed upon by countries of every region, religion, culture, and political system. For good reason. Enforcement gives credibility to a migration system. It helps build trust of citizens in their system and generate public support for generous humanitarian policies. It also helps target scarce social support to those women, children, and men with genuine humanitarian claims. Now, the challenge, therefore, is to balance protection and enforcement. The challenge is to weld these two concepts together, thereby protecting enforcement while enforcing protection. Now, reconciling these concepts is particularly tricky when the flows of people trying to enter a country are mixed. So when migrants with clear humanitarian protection needs are entering alongside migrants who are seeking entry for other reasons. Let us remind ourselves that in some cases, migrants' desire for protection may be genuine and understandable, but their claims for protection are not valid unless they fit the protection categories agreed upon. And picking mixed flows apart and deciding case by case is what makes the asylum process arduous often painful, and sometimes morally conflicting. So what does this mean for us? In the year that just expired, in 2014, the tension between protection and enforcement played out strongly in the Americas, in our region. Undoubtedly, many of you here in this room have been deeply involved, professionally or personally, in the issue of unaccompanied migrant children from Central America and Mexico. And we all know the numbers. More than 68,000 unaccompanied minors arrived at the border in fiscal year 2014, the vast majority of them from Mexico and the three countries of Central America's Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. As this chart here shows you, up until 2011, the average number of unaccompanied minors that had arrived each year had never exceeded 20,000. And most of them had been of Mexican origin, here the red bar. But this pattern has changed. Exponential growth started in 2012 with 24,000 apprehensions, then 38,000 in 2013, and finally 68,000 in 2014. Growth rates were highest for children from Honduras, near the blue bar, followed closely by El Salvador and Guatemala in violet, and El Salvador in green and Guatemala in violet, while the number of Mexican children stayed relatively constant and even fell slightly in 2014. The inflow then peaked in the summer of 2014, and numbers have decreased since. But the question that we're all asking is whether the next peak is just around the corner, waiting for us in the months ahead. We have all seen the headlines, and some of you have helped inform them. The Washington Post wrote in early June, Obama calls wave of children across the US-Mexican border an urgent humanitarian situation. We all have read, and in some instances written, about the reasons: violence, poverty, the desire for family reunification, and also unintended consequences of a US law designed to give special protection to child victims of human trafficking. All of these were frequently cited as contributing factors. Professionalization and adaptation of smuggling networks also played its part. As smugglers develop increasingly sophisticated networks promising end-to-end transportation from remote villages in the Northern Triangle all the way into the United States, while spreading false rumors about permisos, the permits, giving children the right to remain in the United States if they enter alone. And we all have witnessed the attempts of the US government to protect the children, keeping in mind their best interest and simultaneously enforcing the law. Government responses to this child migration crisis have largely followed 4 lines of action. First, the Departments of Homeland Security, Justice, and Health and Human Services have channeled resources for faster and more effective processing to the southwestern border, acknowledging that the surge in numbers was overwhelming. Customs and Border Protection opened new processing centers, and Health and Human Services opened 3 new shelters. The Department of Justice increased the number of immigration judges and attorneys whose work then improved processing times. And this step ensured the first hearing for most unaccompanied minors within 3 weeks of arrival. Second, on the law enforcement side, Operation Coyote, led by the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, cracked down on smuggling networks. And by December 2014, so about 6 months after starting operation, the operation had resulted in nearly 1,000 criminal arrests and the seizure of bank accounts holding more than $1 million. Third, the White House enabled structural changes and institutional reform. Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson appointed the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, to lead a government-wide response for coherent interagency efforts to address the situation. And in November, DHS launched the new Southern Border Joint Task Force to improve coordination and enforcement within DHS. Fourth and final, the Department of State and the White House increased bilateral and regional collaboration. Vice President Biden, and then shortly after, President Obama, met with the presidents of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to discuss regional responses to the situation. A media campaign informed Central American parents of the dangers of sending their children to the United States. Maybe some of you have heard the song that was online trying to deter them from making the trip. And an open letter by Jay Johnson countered the rumors of a permiso. Also, thousands of repatriations were coordinated every week, and wherever we were, we heard renewed discussions on how US support could be channeled better to address root causes of the large-scale exodus. Now, coming back to our topic, how well have these lines of action balanced enforcement and protection so far? Well, judging by the 4 lines of action employed, we see that they have tilted towards enforcement, improving processes of apprehension, detention, and removal. This is in line with historical budget trends that have prioritized enforcement over other areas, such as immigration courts and adjudication. Consider this. Budgets for frontline immigration enforcement have tripled in the last decade, from about 4.5 billion in 2002 to 18 billion in 2013, while funding for the adjudication of immigrants' claims has increased much less, from about 175 million to around 300 million. The result that we end up with is a heavily underfunded system of immigration courts, drawing out the time a migrant spends in the US waiting for the decision of his or her claim. At the high point of this summer's crisis, Congress rejected a supplemental budget request by President Obama for $3.7 billion, with some Republicans arguing the budget failed to sufficiently prioritize border enforcement. Around half of the proposed budget, $1.8 billion, would have gone to Health and Human Services to increase its capacity for care and services, and a little less, about $1.5 billion, would have gone to ICE and CBP to improve enforcement, and the remainder of comparatively small amounts then were planned to support the work of the Department of State with about 300 million and the Department of Justice with about 60 million. The most recent protection effort you probably have read about is an in-country processing program the State Department launched just last month in December 2014. And under this program, Central American children whose parents are in the US legally can apply from their home countries to be admitted legally into the country. While this initiative may keep some children from making the dangerous journey, it is capped at a relatively low number of around 4,000. And advocates argue that it is unclear what dangers children may be exposed to while waiting for their claims to be adjudicated. But children's protection needs do not end with the decision of whether legal status is granted or not. Let's dig a little further. Protection needs extend into what we can call day 2. So the day after the initial processing of a child, the day when children arrive in their new host communities or are returned to their home countries. In the United States, institutions at state and local levels struggle to integrate thousands of children into schools and provide them with the social and medical services they need. In the Northern Triangle, as you all can imagine, this struggle is magnified. Available reintegration services have increased in the last months, with new programs for the immediate attention to returning migrants' needs, such as food, shelter for a few nights, and sometimes bus tickets to bring them back to the place they had left a few weeks prior. But programs and services to support the long-term reintegration of returned children and youth into schools and into employment remain disappointingly scarce. A particularly noteworthy and valuable program I'd like to mention is a reintegration program for Guatemalan children deported from the United States, which is coordinated by Kids in Need of Defense, KIND. And Ariel Summers, the Director of Advocacy of KIND and the presenter at today's first panel, can tell you more about KIND's work with local partners to support the safety and educational progress of children that are returned to Guatemala. Now, this initiative and other reintegration programs for deported children are worthy of attention, and policies should aim to expand them. Because part of protecting these children is investing into reintegration services to stop the revolving door mechanism of migration, deportation, and then renewed migration that many Central Americans, both children and adults, are finding themselves in. Yet, when we discuss policies to improve these services, there's one thing that is sometimes forgotten, and that is the majority of deported Central American children are deported not by the United States, but by Mexico. I brought you some calculation we've done that show that in 2013, more than 7,000 minors were deported from Mexico to the Northern Triangle, compared to less than 500 from the United States. And in 2014, numbers are not available for the US at this time, but Mexico deported more than 16,000 minors. So these statistics underline that for the protection of these children, it is not enough to review US policies and programs. We have to look towards Mexico, which has the responsibility to improve its provision of services to the children it apprehends and deports. And that brings me to the third migration trend I would like to talk about. Mexico is developing into a major migration player in North and Central America, and this new role comes with new responsibilities. I'm not telling you anything new when I say that migration patterns in the Americas have changed fundamentally in the last 20 years. In Mexico, immigration rates have fallen, while at the same time immigration and transit rates and the stock of foreign-born in Mexico, via this slide, have increased. And this message has spread widely since the Pew Research Center's finding of net migration of 0 or less in 2012. So Mexico's new migration realities are, one can argue, old hat by now. What is new, though, are the significant changes in Mexico's migration policies its government has put in place this last year in 2014. In April, President Peña Nieto announced a special migration program developed by the Interior Ministry, which outlined migration priorities for the years 2014 to 18. And they included the promotion of human rights, border security, and the integration and reintegration of migrants. The program's explicit commitment to increasing the number of foreign residents in Mexico and to take advantage of their economic and cultural contributions underline Mexico's willingness to acknowledge its migration realities and to react with new public policies. Shortly after this announcement in July, all eyes were on the launch of the Programa Frontera Sur, the Southern Border Program. Peña Nieto declared the two-pronged aim of the program to protect migrants' human rights on the one hand and to control ports of entry and improve security on the other. So put simply, Mexico's Southern Border Program aims to strike the balance between protection and enforcement. First results were delivered quickly. The Interior Ministry created a unit to coordinate the program, and temporary legal migration between Mexico and its southern neighbors has been increased by issuing regional visitors cards. Oversight of migrants' routes throughout Mexico has intensified, and medical care units and additional consulates in the border region have been opened to improve health and legal services for migrants in transit. Also, collaborations with the Northern Triangle has increased. So today, 6 months into the Southern Border Program, we also see increasingly aggressive enforcement strategies. A widely reported crackdown on La Bestia makes riding atop the chain through Mexico even more risky than in the past. New interior checkpoints on highways and known migrant routes close to Guatemala's border block migrants' transit with the help of high-tech infrared sensors and gamma ray detectors. Border control systems copied from California. Deportations have also increased markedly. Mexico's National Migration Institute, the INM, apprehended and sent back more than 87,000 migrants from the Northern Triangle in fiscal year 14. And that is 14% more than in 2013, and if you look at the slide, 50% more than in 2011. The message here is clear. Mexico is taking steps to control its southern border. Now, all of us here, as participants of the conference on humanitarian action, must ask one question. We must ask, what is the humanitarian impact of these steps? Criticism of the Southern Border Program and Mexico's increased enforcement capabilities abound. Advocacy and migrant organizations warn that human rights abuses of migrants have worsened, and that corruption in Mexico's INM remains notorious. Within 6 months, Mexico's National Human Rights Commission, the CNDH, recorded 268 complaints filed against the INM for violations of human rights at migrant detention centers. News reports and interviews with smugglers suggest that bribes for INM agents continue to be an expected expense for migrants making the trip. And a recent UNHCR study shows that nearly 3 out of 4 Central American children in Mexican detention centers are not fully informed about their rights for protection including the right to file for asylum in Mexico. We also read disconcerting warnings from service providers, churches, and shelters in southern Mexico about side effects of this aggressive enforcement. Migrants cut off from the established routes are stranded now in Mexico's migrant shelters next to the Guatemala border. So in the past, most migrants used to stay and recuperate in these shelters only for a few days before moving on. But now many are staying semi-permanently. In contrast, shelters along the traditional transit routes remain empty as the journey has become more dangerous, often leading through cartel territory, and police encounters are increasingly common. Finally, there are some unconfirmed rumors that Grupos Beta, the specialized INM forces to provide humanitarian help to migrants, no longer just provide food and medical help, but may help other INM agents to track down and detain migrants. Now, we cannot always know how trustworthy the sources of this information are. Let me be clear about this. Reliable reports and unfounded rumors sometimes are like lookalikes in the police lineup, so they're hard to tell apart. But one thing we do know, Mexico's challenge for 2015 and beyond is to develop its role as a regional migration manager and live up to the responsibilities that this role comes with. Concretely, I suggest that this means actions in 3 directions. First, Mexico should continue to expand collaboration with Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to alleviate root causes of migration and, more and more urgently, to improve reintegration processes and services. Deportees are a rapidly growing population in Central America, and they need to be a policy priority, and Mexico has a regional co-responsibility in their fate. Second, Mexico should continue its enforcement collaboration with the United States in order to discourage children from making the dangerous trip north, but it must also strengthen its focus on rights protection to ensure that those in need of humanitarian relief are not denied the protection that they deserve. Mexico's changing role in the region also changes the responsibility it has towards its neighbors to be a stronger partner. And third, Mexico's strive to improve its services and legal recourse for migrants should continue, including the INM services delivered by Grupos Beta and the so-called OPIs, the child protection officials. You see, the larger context for this effort is Mexico's struggle to increase rule of law and decrease impunity. And migration policy in this is really only one piece of the puzzle of Mexico's public policies. It cannot fully function as long as some of its connecting pieces are still scattered on the floor. Now, in conclusion, let me leave you with 3 thoughts. First, the unaccompanied minor issue has receded from the headlines for now, but it might return, and policymakers should plan for this possibility. Monthly apprehensions of unaccompanied minors from Central America at the United States border have dropped from the high point of more than 10,000 in May and June 2014, which you saw earlier, to today 2,000 to 3,000. High levels still, one can argue, but they are comparable to prior years. Yet we do not know how these numbers will develop. Secretary Johnson cautioned in December the spike in migration we saw this summer could return. So think of the metaphor of the pig and the python. The python has, with much effort, swallowed the pig. The pig is now slowly making its way through the system, and the python is busy digesting it. The last thing the python wants is another pig. But it could be that the next pig is just around the corner. It could be that the numbers of children and families turning themselves in to Border Patrol agents will rise again. And if that happens, the US immigration system will have no choice but to stomach the challenge. So we should learn from the python. The smart python makes up his or her strategy before she is eye to eye with the next pig. Now, second, the systems of processing and adjudicating immigrants' claims need to be strengthened, and that is both for Mexico and for the United States. Mexico needs to ensure that the migrants it apprehends receive full information about their rights and access to protection. A quick processing system is desirable, but it should not be at the expense of complete and individualized case reviews. Meanwhile, the US immigration system has gained unwanted fame for long delays before a hearing and insufficient legal services for claimants. Long wait times cripple the functioning of the system of both enforcement and protection. Migrants with a valid claim remain in limbo for months and years, cut off from services and delaying their integration. In contrast, migrants without a valid claim get to spend long periods of time in the United States waiting for their decision. The average processing time for a migrant to move through the system stood at more than 500 days in 2013. Durable solutions have to increase budgets and resources of the immigration court system to decrease inordinate delays. Without those investments, what we see is a lose-lose situation in which both protection and enforcement suffer. And third and last, bringing it back into this room, in the absence of policies that allow for a perfect balance of protection and enforcement, some of the burden to care for vulnerable populations falls on the shoulders of humanitarian organizations. The Red Cross and many other international, national, and local organizations work to provide services that are, in the actual sense of the word, life-saving. Many of you in this room dedicate your lives to improve services, big and small, to migrants and refugees. These contributions matter, and today's conference matters, as our conversations on and off stage inform our work and spark new ideas and collaborations. So it has been a pleasure to present a few ideas that keep me and my colleagues at the Migration Policy Institute busy. But it will be an even greater pleasure to step aside and to hear your thoughts and your ideas throughout the course of the day, to listen to the ideas of our esteemed colleagues and panelists. I thank you very much for your attention. I commend the Red Cross once more for bringing us all together today, and I wish all of us a successful and a thought-provoking conference. Thank you.
Yes, I'm looking at it. Are there any, I have some questions here that have been sent by the app. One of them is, Victoria, what are the factors that determine how many asylees a country will accept?
That is a very broad question about asylum policies around the world, which under normal circumstances I would immediately refer to Kathleen Newland, our expert on asylum policies. So I just keep it very brief and say the factors are definitely the socioeconomic situation in a country, because that is what often influences the population's willingness to support policies that are more generous in humanitarian regard. But I'm happy to refer further to our experts.
Okay. Someone needed to make a quick announcement.
Yes, I have a quick announcement. Remember, if you have a question, you can use the event app if you want to have like some anonymity with your question asking. Otherwise, you can come up here, or if you just don't want to make the trek to the middle of the room, you can come up here and ask your question. Thank you.
If you want to do it the old-fashioned way, in other words, face-to-face. Yes. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to congratulate Victoria, because this is a presentation in which I have a very good example of clearness and sincerity about this very difficult issue. Now I can say that in 2009 in Geneva, we had a meeting in which, organized by the UNHCR, the IOM was there, people from the US Embassy in Geneva, permanent mission, and the ambassador of Mexico. And there was a very clear and deep reflection about the migration issues. I remember the ambassador of Mexico said, "My concern is that we are publicly criticizing the United States. And we are doing the same in the southern border with Guatemala. And I see that on the political side, there is a lot of progress in dealing with this issue by the governments of the region. And the government of the United States is to be praised for having entered in this way of dialogue with the other countries. At the same time, for the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, it is also a great day. There is a long way since in 2007 in Guayaquil, we had 100 representatives of the Red Cross in the Americas discussing about migration. It was a side event to the Inter-American Conference. At that moment, there was not clarity in the Red Crosses about the need to work on this issue. Some national societies were even opposed. There were very different opinions between the American Red Cross, which had a very difficult situation with the government and on the migration issue inside, the Canadian Red Cross, the Mexican Red Cross, but it was a starting point, and I am really very, very happy that this meeting is hosted by a country, by a national society that is leading many important initiatives in the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. And also I'm very happy that the ICRC, which is the main humanitarian diplomacy organization of the world, a master organization in this. We don't imagine all what the ICRC has done in the world because they work under the rule of secrecy to try to get more by dialogue, by persuasion, than by activities in the media.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but do you have a question for me?
Sorry, that's no, but let me simply say that I have many questions, but I would like only to stress or to underline that this is the way in which in all countries the institutes dealing with migration should work. This is a very good example. The Migration Policy Institute is giving us a lesson, and we have to take this lesson. So this is, I wanted to put this in the context of our Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. Thank you.
Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? And if you could introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Norma Cavazos, and I'm an advocate with the American Red Cross. My question is, do you have numbers of the children and the families that have been returned to Central America that are actually making this dangerous trip back to the US?
So the short answer would be, we have some numbers. We do not have exactly those numbers because it would be very difficult to keep track of the kids, whether you basically keep track of deportations and not necessarily of individual people. So individual people can be deported various times or can be returned various times without us being able to tell always whether that is the same person or not. What we do have is a good sense of the numbers of children that have been returned and the numbers of adults as well. Some of them I showed here. And what we also have is a sense of what type of reintegration services are available to these people once they return. And from that, we can infer that if there are good services available in some areas, more people are likely to leave, less people are likely to leave again. And where the services are less good, more people are likely to leave again. And that is, in fact, one of our research areas right now, trying to figure out how well do the systems in place function to reintegrate children, and how can they be improved in order to decrease this number that, again, we don't have a fixed number of. But I would venture to argue that every child that feels the need to leave again after having gone through this cycle is one child too much.
Yes. And do you know what the time span is once they return, how quickly they come back again?
For children, I would not know that.
Okay.
For adults, you hear everything, stories from people who basically get off the bus and then turn around, just walk around the bus station, and there's the recruiters, the coyotes waiting again, and they sign up again to leave. To people that, return home and try and make it, but because of socioeconomic conditions, because of violence, because of all the reasons that made them leave in the first time, they decided to turn around and leave again.
And do you have any results as to what is indeed happening with the children that are returned to their countries and what their life is like back again once they return?
Yeah, I have a sense of that, but I would say this is a question that I know that KIND, Kids in Need of Defense, have very on-the-ground experience with. And again, Aria Summers, she'll be in the first panel, and they lead a program that has helped Guatemalan kids deported from the United States kind of find footing again in Guatemala, and she can tell you about the problems that they encounter, really everything from being able to find the family to then being able to go back into a school, and the school may not necessarily mean safety, right?
Right.
And yeah, so I would refer you to her, and of course I'll be happy to talk more about the research we do.
Thank you so much.
I wanted to ask you a question, Victoria. Two questions actually. You had the number of the children that were deported, but do you know what that number represents vis-a-vis the ones who actually make it? In other words, Mexico can say, yes, we are deporting 8,000, 7,000, I think was the figure. But if there are 68,000 making it to the US border to be processed, then that means that they're essentially getting 100%, at least.
So I will not venture a guess and make that number while I don't have it exactly here. That's a big no-no for me. But I know that there will be panelists both from ICE and from CBP that will be able to shed some light on these numbers. And again, happy to talk off stage a little more about numbers that we do have available. This one, I could venture a guess. We'll probably do it in a private conversation, not necessarily now.
Okay. All right. And then the other question was, how much of this effort by Mexico is really something to placate the United States, given the huge problems that Mexico has dealing with problems as children that disappear on their way to school and are found in mass graves, and the problems that all of these children are fleeing in Central America, taking them in a refugee center and holding their hands for a couple of weeks. That really going to alleviate the root causes of why they're left in the first place?
It's an interesting and a good question. I would say though that if our reaction to Mexico stepping up and taking responsibility is to be negative about it and say, oh, you're just placating the United States, I think we are killing off the good attempts that could have good impact. So I think instead we should really focus on the attempts that have been made and how, in collaboration with the United States and with the southern neighbors of Mexico, these efforts can be stepped up. I think we've seen that in the past, and I think that would be the right and a little more positive way of going about it. Because so often, maybe that's the final word on this, but so often migration news are spinned negatively. And I think what we need, in addition to more neutral and balanced information about migration, is also to tell a little bit the good stories about it.
We have one final question.
Am I between the break? I'm just asking.
Between people and coffee.
Is that your question?
Good morning. My name is Derek Chubbs. I'm the Division Vice President for Southwestern Rocky Mountains Division of the American Red Cross. And Victoria, thank you so much for being here. I think I speak for all of us when I say you brought some very interesting information, of which there's one particular piece of data that I saw that I want to verify that that's what I saw and then ask a question. I think what I saw was that Mexico is in fact number 2 when it comes to those seeking asylum into the country behind China. My question, and I don't know, Armando, maybe the question is to you. We hear very little of that. If I do a poll throughout the Southwest, I guarantee you, I can only speak for my 1,000,000 square miles. I guarantee you the question would be, or the number one answer would be Mexico. Why is it that we hear so little about the fact that that is China and not necessarily Mexico? Have you, or Armando, either one of you, because part of it is what's being reported.
I think it goes back to what I just mentioned, the importance really of neutral and balanced information about topics. And I will not, blame journalists. Journalists obviously have to write where there is an interest in it.
Armando, you're not off the hook.
As Armando.
I have an answer.
But I think, on just a very commonsensical level, I mean, obviously there would be more reporting about things relating to Mexico in the southwest of the US than there would be about China.
Yeah.
So by definition, I think that's, not a surprising phenomenon. And what we are trying to do at the Migration Policy Institute, and what I know also a lot of you are trying to do, is kind of to clarify and to give a little nuance to the story. Because it is true that there are a lot of asylum seekers from Mexico, but the fact is, they're not the country that sends the most. And to know that, and that helps you put something into perspective, that helps you maybe judge the overall situation in a little more benign and more informed terms.
But, and just for the record, I do listen to national news. I do get out of Texas every day.
National news is
You won't hear me say that, Armando.
I was never insinuating anything.
All right, so to partially answer your question, you can stand next to me. Bask in my warmth. I think that you have to distinguish between asylum seekers, which are the numbers that Victoria was addressing, and illegal immigration patterns. Two different things altogether. So we don't see a lot of people coming from China crossing the US-Mexico border through a fence, smuggled in a back of a van. And I think that is part of it. I think the more visible immigrants, whether it's an asylum seeker, a legitimate asylum seeker, or not, however you want to define it, are the people coming from the Northern Triangle and from Mexico. The Chinese immigrants and asylums, and even the undocumented Chinese, are coming in much more, I don't want to say subtle, but less visible manners. And it's a community that, and I have run into this when I try to do stories on non-Hispanic immigrants. They are more insular. They're more enclosed. It's a cultural thing. They are not as out there. You don't have a national Chinese language TV network, radio network. They're not in your face to the level that the Hispanic population is. And so out of mind, out of sight, out of mind. And I think probably for the undocumented Chinese, they're very happy, because if you're going to, enforce against one community or another, the more undercover you are, the better you are. But I would say that if you were to go to New York, I would think that ICE authorities in New York are going after undocumented Chinese there, because that's one of the places where I think you could find them, also San Francisco, Los Angeles. But I think part of it is just that you don't see them because their migration pattern is coming. Just like you don't see a lot of people from other parts of the world that are coming here illegally. It's just the ones that are coming here illegally in a much more visible fashion. my opinion.
Thank you.
I would just add to that, if I may, very last thing, that
You have to have the last word, right? By all means.
I would agree with parts of what was just said, and especially emphasize the differentiation that Armando very well mentioned about, refugees versus asylum seekers versus undocumented versus documented. In the media, all of these are quite often lumped together, and I think that may also contribute to the observation you made.
I guess one of the things that just stuck out in my mind, that according to the data, was there significantly more. It wasn't just couple hundred folk. It was what, 1.2 million or something versus.
Happy to speak more about that.
Yeah, we'll take it offline.
I
We'll
see
take it
Nadia
offline.
and I see the clock, and I don't want her to feel sorry for having
Never. Thank you so much for We're gonna take a break and divide the room. So if you can go ahead and take your coffee break, we're gonna make sure that the divider goes up and everything continues. We'll join back in. Pardon? Okay, so I think A and B. So A is on this side, B is on this side. So if you look at your agenda, select whichever one you're attending and go to that area. And but go to have coffee first.
You're sticking around, you gotta take off. Good. Yeah, that was actually.
For those of you watching the live stream, we are going to continue the live stream. We're going to pause the audio for a second, but we'll be back in just a few minutes.
The ones who come. the Washington, D.C. area where I've lived since 1992 and where I have seen the unaccompanied children and families issue grow for the past 10 years. This has not been a new phenomenon at all, regardless of what you may have seen on other stations and other media, certainly not on ours. Situation of children coming alone has been happening here in the Metro DC area for quite some time. And the problem that has arisen is the overwhelming numbers in which those children came in the last year. That is really what prompted the crises that many of the local organizations that have tried to address the needs of these children have encountered. Not that they're coming, but they're just coming in huge numbers. And we're talking about organizations like Ayuda, Southern Maryland, Identity, and every other organization in the Metro DC area, Unidad del Pueblo, Latin American Youth Center, and then we're talking about the school system, which is where these children will ultimately wind up, at least for some time until their cases are adjudicated. And the stress of bilingual teachers, ESOL teachers, trauma counselors, and all of the other things that are part of that, of addressing the needs of all those children, things that all of these organizations have had to address in this last year. All on our air, by the way, because I've covered all of those angles for those children. So the people on this panel are the people that represent the front lines in this issue, people that are looking into the eyes of desperate parents, confused and scared children, and try to do the best that they can for them in what is a very unsure and secure and chaotic system. I'm going to introduce first Leslie. Is it Velez or Velez?
Velez.
Leslie Velez. She is the Senior Protection Officer for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. I will let her tell you a little bit about herself, and then obviously she can take it away with her presentation. Leslie, buenos dias. Bienvenida, welcome.
Buenos dias. Thank you very much. So I am the Senior Protection Officer, and I head the U.S. Protection Unit for the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which is a regional office based here in Washington that covers the United States as well as the Caribbean countries and region. I am going to just go ahead and jump right in to our presentation, and we'll be messaging with you today. I think the top line is that we are in the midst of a humanitarian situation in the region. I think the term humanitarian crisis has been used to describe what we heard earlier in terms of an increasing number of children that outweighed the capacity of the United States to be able to efficiently respond at a certain point, but it predates this year. And so the UN Refugee Agency has been watching the numbers of unaccompanied children doubling, who arrive to the United States, double every year since 2011. We had, and actually as a baseline, I want to put this out there, that in 2008, we did an interview sampling of unaccompanied children in southern Mexico to identify, of this flow and this phenomenon that's of great concern. We see unaccompanied children as part of the migration narrative in this region, but we wanted to understand of the flow, how many of them have international protection concerns, if any. And at that time, the sample that we had reviewed, we found actually that 13% had international protection concerns. So let me fast forward. 2011, the numbers doubled, 12 again, 13 again, and I don't think anyone anticipated, even though maybe the writing was on the wall, that it would increase so dramatically in 2014, which is what happened this summer. The numbers are alarming, so let me review what happened in the fiscal year 2014. The United States received an upwards of 60,000 children who arrived alone to US soil, meaning that they were not accompanied by a parent or a guardian. But what's also unfortunately very invisible is that an equal number, 60,000 children, arrived to US soil accompanied by their mother or their father or both. Okay, so we're now talking about a flow of 120,000 children that have arrived to US soil. And it's within this context, actually, let me back up. One of the less glorious functions of the UN Refugee Agency is to track statistics of various governments in terms of how many asylum applications have been lodged and by whom and what's the approval rate. And so we tracked, when we narrow our focus down to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, we've been tracking that has been on the rise. So in particular, by those asylum applications brought by children. The US, of course, receives a large percentage of this total asylum applications from individuals from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, reaching over 80%, so about 83%, given the year. In 2012, actually, it was 83. But the number of asylum applications has increased to countries other than the United States. So combined, we have Mexico, Panama, Nicaragua in particular, Costa Rica, Belize. All of that registered a 712% increase in the number of asylum applications from individuals from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala since 2009. So this, for the UN Refugee Agency, is a pretty big red flag. And that's in the context in which we embarked in a new study in 2013 to really understand, well, what is happening. And it's really the stories behind these numbers that are actually very heart-wrenching. So part of our research, we interviewed 404 children, aiming for 100 children from each of the 3 countries I've mentioned before, as well as 100 children from Mexico. And we did so asking very open-ended questions. Our survey and questionnaire is available online, should you wish to see it, to really understand the biographics. Where are children leaving from? Where are they going? Why are they leaving? Why now? To really understand, within this context and this alarming number, is it increased poverty, or are there other protection needs, especially international protection needs? What we found, actually, here's the headline from the research, is that nearly 60% of the children that we interviewed are fleeing situations of chronic violence. Almost 100% of the children described leaving situations of entrenched poverty, but what was really new for us was their descriptions of leaving situations of chronic violence, whether it be in their homes or in their communities, by a number of various actors. So some it would be from, we to say, criminal, armed, and organized groups, which incorporates both, let's say, drug trafficking organizations, or even various gangs, whether it's at the community level, the neighborhood level, or the transnational nature of what has now become another phenomenon with gangs, that have power, that are crossing borders in the region. For an example, one of the 15-year-old girl told us that she left because in El Salvador, quote, they take young girls, rape them, throw them into bags if they resist becoming a girlfriend of a gang person. And when you take that one narrative multiplied by many, for the purposes of our research, we needed to draw the line for where do we hold it out at international protection needs. Let me remind everyone that we did not conduct refugee status determinations. On the contrary, we asked very open-ended questions, and we got responses from this 15-year-old girl to our open-ended questions as to why she left. And since that time, in 2013, what we know about the flow is obviously that the number in the flow is much larger. The children are younger, particularly if they're accompanied by one of their parents or both of their parents. And there are a lot more girls in the flow, okay? So our own research, and especially when you see it in light of unbiased, well-documented research coming out of numerous universities in the region, including in the United States, is that here's what we have. We previously had a narrative of migration that included this phenomenon of unaccompanied children that were on the move for various reasons. But it's very clear to the UN Refugee Agency at this point that that narrative has changed. And in order to understand how to address, solutions in this context, we really needed to understand, well, what are the needs of individuals? And so the narrative of migration has changed, requiring a humanitarian response that will keep kids safe. For some of them, it might be in their best interest to be returned home to families. And some of them have actually left their families to reunite with family members they haven't lived with in years, because that's their vision of being safe from whatever they're leaving from. So the UN Refugee Agency's role in all of this is to help identify and ensure that children, accompanied or unaccompanied, and for that matter, any refugee or person who is fleeing violence, whether it be a single male, a single female, that they have access to, that they can be identified and have access to asylum procedures of countries, including the United States and Mexico and Nicaragua, okay? So we're seeing that there's forced displacement. It's crossing now international borders, so we're kind of the last red flag in this narrative when it's crossed international borders. And that the flow, yes, is going north to United States, but when we register a 238% increase in asylum applications in Nicaragua, this is very strong evidence for us that the flow is also going south. We, of course, support the US and all the countries in the region, and will continue to support the response and the humanitarian response. The solutions for us have always been three-pronged. It's a regional situation. Honduras alone, although they have very publicly asked for assistance from other governments, from the international community to help offer protection from a problem that they have formally recognized as an internal displacement challenge. But they alone can't solve this. It's a regional issue requiring regional collaboration for regional solutions. And for the humanitarian response outside of the United States, UNHCR, when you compare what's happening in Central America to the five emergencies that UNHCR is dealing with around the world, actually this situation pales in comparison to 3 million now having been forcibly displaced out of Syria. When the numbers, I think at the peak was 10,000 children who were crossing the border into the United States, which is a daily outflow from Syria into neighboring countries. When we look at, we add the unaccompanied and the accompanied children, 120,000 children, versus Lebanon, which is a country of 4 million, and it is currently hosting, despite all of the political challenges, over 1 million. So a quarter of their population, they're hosting 1 million visitors and guests within Lebanon from Syria. And in terms of the domestic response for the United States, we're really working with the US government to the extent possible to lead by example as a leader in refugee protection. It's important to honor the legal commitments and allow access to asylum and protections, not just asylum, but complementary forms of protection. So I'm going to summarize by flagging the current state of play and the concerns, the priority concerns for the UN Refugee Agency at this juncture. Some time has passed. So what has happened? The UN Refugee Agency put out their report based on research about the number of people within this flow that may have international protection concerns. We actually launched a second study interviewing unaccompanied children in Mexico that have been detected by Mexican authorities to identify of that flow how many have protection concerns. And actually, we found that nearly 50% of them had been directly threatened with violence. And so, while this is convincing us to offer more attention and to dedicate what are already limited resources to respond, as this is our mandate, we now have, the US statistics. So once, especially the accompanied children and families, when they go through the US process, which includes expedited removal and credible fear, we have a percentage actually larger than ours. So it's over 60%, somewhere between 60 and 80%, depending on the month and how you slice it, that are actually passing a pretty rigorous fraud detection mechanism to vet out what should be legitimate asylum claims. And that's a pretty high passage rate by the US government's own standards. So at this point, what we have now is we've got the numbers, and the US government is now identifying what they call legitimate asylum claims. And many of these claims now with fast-track procedures are actually winning their asylum claims in a very timely fashion. But again, the forced displacement narrative requires the humanitarian response that recognizes and addresses the refugee dimension in this flow. It's much easier to address a refugee situation when we know, like in situations of Syria, where a large percentage of them are refugees, right? Because then it relieves the burden of trying to identify within the mixed flow who is and who isn't. And whether it's 5% or 90%, it's still the function of governments to identify those individuals who are in need of international protection to facilitate access to asylum procedures. And the UN Refugee Agency is prioritizing working with governments to double down on building the capacity to facilitate asylum in countries south, so Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Belize, but in particular focusing on Mexico at this time. And the US already has a very well-developed asylum process. And so being able to facilitate and continue to facilitate access there is what we're trying to do. Within this context, we have a new challenge, which is the increased use, let me just start by saying the increased use of enforcement. We've heard the public messaging around greater enforcement, both in the US, in Mexico, and part of the enforcement package includes, there's two dimensions to that. One is an increased and concerning use of detention, especially when the public messaging is the use of detention for purposes of deterrence. There's an inconvenient truth maybe at this juncture, maybe that's the best way to say it, but the law is pretty well settled that detention for purposes of deterrence is unlawful. And to the extent that it impedes access to asylum, it runs afoul of the prohibition of non-refoulement. So in our Mexico report, we found that, that detention is actually strongly discouraging and forcing individuals to abandon their already lodged asylum claims with the prospect of staying in detention facilities that were built for enforcement purposes with a stay contemplated for 48 hours, not for the 90 days, 45, 90 days it takes to go through an asylum process. And children are also in these types of facilities. In terms of the enforcement paradigm, it's closely approaching on Mexico's southern border an interdiction paradigm, and any kind of enforcement action has to account for the identification of persons in need of international protection and facilitate their access to asylum, or again, it runs risk of being measured against the prohibition of refoulement. And refoulement is basically the prohibition under customary international law, under the convention for the status of refugees, especially the absolute prohibition under the Convention Against Torture, which is that a country will not send a person back to a place where they fear for their lives, freedom, or torture. There has been in this public narrative the question about the issue of permisos, of smugglers. And I'm not going to say much about that other than to say we are very convinced from all of the data that, and we see this all over the globe, is that the more that there are enforcement measures at the same time that there are people who are fleeing, who are forcibly displaced, and they need to get from point A to point B in order to access safety. You know, it went from, I think, a narrative that used to be one about an individual being a customer of smugglers, and now it's more about that individual is now a commodity, which is creating a whole other set of protection issues. But it's this narrative that's gone from customer to commodity that I think is being conflated with the reasons and the root causes of why individuals are leaving, when actually it's two separate things. It's actually a consequence of a demand for safe passage to a certain place. And so finally, in terms of solutions, I wanted to offer one more thing. it's very important for all countries, and we stand together with them as our role as the UN Refugee Agency to improve access to asylum, to improve conditions of reception for people who are trying to access asylum. And in terms of in-country processing, which we'll discuss at a later point, there's the US response, and there's also this bilateral effort between the US and Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, so that people can access refugee protection, or even access being a family reunification program. This is a very positive step from the US government to provide protection to children and reunite families. UNHCR is not involved, and that's simply for reasons of our mandate doesn't recognize that a person still in their country is a refugee, when the US refugee definition allows for that. And we simply have, with our limited resources, other compelling priorities, especially in Honduras, is to support the protection of internally displaced people, especially for children who are being returned in this enforcement mechanism from Mexico. So we have a lot less concern about the very organized fashion in which the US is deporting children, but a lot more concern about this turnstile of children who are on buses being returned to situations, and hopefully Gerardo will speak more to what that looks like on the receiving end. But that is of major concern, especially when children cannot be returned to their home community because they have protection concerns. So what happens next? And that's where we're focusing our energy. So the in-country processing is an option that's important to complement, but it cannot wholly substitute for adequate protection mechanisms within the region and asylum protection in the US. And indeed, US law recognizes that refugees cross borders spontaneously. That is the basis of US asylum law. And it allows for people who arrive to US soil, even though they are in irregular migration patterns, they're not illegal, they're not entering illegally. There is a recognized right to seek asylum and to apply for asylum and to have their claims heard by officials. So that's our take on the situation. I think I overdid my time, but thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you. We're going to take questions at the very end after all of the panelists are done to just facilitate things. Next, and by the way, let me just introduce everyone on the panel before we go on to the next speaker. Our next speaker will be Jessica Jones. She is a Children and Youth Policy Associate with Lutheran Immigrant Refugee Services. But we also have Stacie Blake. She's Director of Government and Community Relations at the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, and we have Luis Gerardo Rivera, Director of Casa Alianza, and they'll be speaking later. But now it's Jessica Jones. Jessica, good morning.
Thank you. I'm really glad actually to be among all of you again. I had the privilege of speaking at a previous Red Cross conference, and I learned a lot from all of you through your questions and insights. So before I begin my remarks, I thought I would give you a brief overview of the work that Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service does. So we have served refugees and vulnerable migrants for over 75 years. We partner with the Office of Refugee Resettlement in the Department of Health and Human Services to provide an array of services for migrant children, unaccompanied refugee children resettled in the U.S., as well as other resettled refugee adults and families. LARS is also a unique ORR partner in that we provide social services to unaccompanied children at every stage, from initial placement with ORR until reunification with families. And some of our other partners provide, including USCRI, and I know Kristen Peck from USCCB is also here in the room. They also provide an array of social services partnering with ORR. Through our Access to Justice program, we provide a network of support for detained torture survivors, a community-based service model as an alternative to detention for adults, and visitation programs. Over the holidays, thanks to many of our partners and to you, we successfully collected over 1,000 gifts for children who are incarcerated in immigration detention facilities holding families. So I'm going to focus my remarks on sort of the protection mechanisms that are in place for unaccompanied children as well as accompanied children. And focusing in particular on the social services, because I know Stacie is going to be covering more the legal side of things as well. So as Leslie mentioned, this year the US reached a critical juncture in our response towards the child protection mechanism for migrant children. This year, with the unprecedented numbers of children, both those who were traveling alone and those who were accompanied, that is, children who were traveling with parents, we as a nation started to reconsider how we treat these children. And we started to call into question actually using the best interests of the child into our service model. As Leslie mentioned, this has been an unprecedented number of children that have arrived. So we've seen over 68,000 unaccompanied children, and then 68,000 family units.
Let me stop you there.
Yeah.
Those are the numbers of the ones that have actually been detained by authorities. So the number could actually be higher. I mean, that's one of the things that the numbers that are talked about are always talked about the ones that actually fall into U.S. government hands. But there are those who actually make it across.
Right, and I would say that's a much more difficult number to try to capture.
Actually, but I just want to stress that the universe is not 128,000.
I will say that from what LARS has seen in our interviews with children, most of these children are actually walking up to Border Patrol agents and are wanting to be apprehended, so to speak. So it's not, I don't know that it's exactly fair to say that our borders are really porous. We do have really secure borders overall. So once the children are actually apprehended, they are taken into custody of Customs and Border Protection. Most of these children are being apprehended by Border Patrol and not the Office of Field Operations, OFO. And they're supposed to be transferred within 72 hours to the Office of Refugee Resettlement if they're unaccompanied. If they're accompanied, they're supposed to be transferred out either to be released or into ICE custody, and that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So with the huge increase of the flow of migration, asylum-seeking families and unaccompanied children, we saw these unprecedented numbers, and that had a huge impact on actually ORR's ability to take the custody of these children. And we saw in June, there was a height of 10,000 children. So just to put that in perspective, that was more than we've ever seen prior to fiscal year 2012. Typically, the average flows were somewhere from 7,000 to 8,000 a year.
And the system was designed to respond to that number.
Exactly. So that's why we saw over the summer so many children being held in CBP, Customs and Border Protection facilities, for much longer periods. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the conditions in the CBP holding facilities because I know the next panel after lunch is a panel on detention, and I'm sure they're going to cover that in greater detail. So back to the services. So once, I think I should pause here just to stress how, because of this increased migration of unaccompanied children and accompanied children, the US government had made a strong sort of position and stance on the need to keep accompanied children in custody, as Leslie mentioned, as a form of deterrence for future migration. So my remarks are going to sort of highlight the different types of services that these children are receiving, whether they're unaccompanied children or whether they're accompanied. So unaccompanied children are transferred to Health and Human Services to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Now, they are mandated to actually care for the best interests of the child. So this is a very different mandate than what Immigration and Customs Enforcement has for their custody operations. So once in the Office of Refugee Resettlement, unaccompanied children are usually placed in transitional shelter programs or transitional foster care programs. And in some cases, they're held in staff secure or secure facilities or therapeutic facilities. After the placement, a child gets a full psychosocial assessment, a medical assessment. They receive on-site educational services, counseling services, and other additional services as needed. And at the same time, caseworkers work to locate family members in order to reunify the child with those family members. And in addition, LIRS actually works alongside ORR to conduct the family reunification assessment, which includes fingerprinting of potential family members, often termed as sponsors. This whole process of family reunification can take anywhere from, on average, 7 days to 25. So this has been a process that's been expedited. In the past, it used to be anywhere from 60 to 90 days. So we're seeing this has been greatly accelerated over the past 2 years or 3 years with the increase of children entering into ORR custody. After this assessment, the child is released to the family member in their communities, and they remain with that family member for the duration of their immigration court case. And right now, the vast majority of these children, well over 90%, are actually living with family members throughout the U.S. The top sort of 5 release areas are Texas, California, New York, the D.C., Maryland metro area.
I just checked numbers. There's 8,400 in D.C., Virginia, and Maryland as of 2015. There's less than 6,000 in California. So one of the biggest states in the country, and if you look at within the Metro DC area, Fairfax, Montgomery, and Georges as the bulk.
You can go on the website. They actually post the data state by state and county by county. So upon release, only a small percentage of these children are actually going to be getting post-release social services or home studies with an additional post-release follow-up services. So we at LARS are actually seeing that only maybe about 10% of the ones that are in our program are actually getting these services. That's a huge sort of protection issue and concern for us, because now that children are being rapidly reunified with their family members, the amount of services that they're actually getting in ORR custody is minimal. And then upon release, the vast majority of them are going through a straight release program where they're not getting any sort of follow-up services to help them locate legal services, help them identify other community support programs within their community, or facilitate enrollment in schools. So our recommendation is definitely that this is something that needs to be greatly expanded. And then for the small percentage of children that are actually going to be remaining in ORR custody, they typically are being transferred to long-term foster care programs and if they gain some sort of legal relief, they can then be transferred to the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor program. One of the advantages of being transferred over to that program is that you can actually stay there up until the age of 21 instead of 18. So in comparison, accompanied children are being transferred over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. Prior to 2014, I would say that our government put a greater emphasis on the protection of families, and they favored a policy of release into the community. and placement into alternatives to detention. So prior to 2014, there was only one family detention facility, and it was a 90-bed facility. And now we're seeing it being ramped up to over 4,000 beds, with the government actually asking for additional money to increase the detention beds. Leslie actually talked a little bit about what these detention facilities are like. They're very penal. These are, they're placing mothers with children as young as babies in these highly restrictive detention facilities. And in comparison, these children are not getting the same sort of services. So they're staying in custody for long periods of time, as Leslie mentioned, as they're pursuing their asylum claims. And they're not getting all the same services that an unaccompanied child will get. And I actually included in the materials a one-pager sort of analysis of the Flores Settlement Agreement, which is a piece of litigation that sort of outlined all the rights that an immigrant child actually has when they're in federal custody. And it goes through in sort of great detail all the gaps and ways that DHS is not complying with their obligations under Flores to provide children with the least restrictive type of custody. And we would argue that the least restrictive would be to release them because they have a parent who is available to take care of them and provide custody to them. So moving on to the protection needs, LRS has also noticed sort of a change in the type of protection needs of these children. And Leslie mentioned it, increasingly we're seeing more and more horrifying stories about the conditions in Central America. We see a range of cases that are just absolutely horrifying, of, as Leslie mentioned, of girls being forced into gang relationships to serve as wives, and we're seeing younger and younger girls. So right now it's a 77% increase in the number of girls from what it was last year. We're also seeing a huge increase in the number of tender age kids. So just over this past year, every single quarter we've seen it go up to the point where 53% of the children in our custody are under the age of 9, and 9% are actually under the age of 4. And some of the stories that these children have are just horrifying. Accounts of toddlers being threatened of being killed by gangs as punishment to their families. And yeah, so horrifying stories, and I'm sure a lot of you have actually heard some of these. So this also compounds our interest in sort of expanding the need for post-release social services for these children. And I would add that for the accompanied children, we're hearing the same sort of stories as well. So these children are coming with their parents, but they're also fleeing for similar protection issues. 2 minutes, okay. Okay, well, maybe I'll just wrap up right there. I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have, and I'll let Stacie talk about.
Yeah, we'll take questions at the end. Thank you very much. Okay, Stacie. Stacie is our next presenter. She's with the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. Stacie, take it away.
Thank you, Armando. Yesterday, my office neighbor down the hall, my colleague, told me in preparation for this presentation, she said, we used to receive referrals of children who had been traumatized and raped during their journey to the U.S. Because of the number of children and the still limited services available, as Jessica was just mentioning. Now, a child really will need to have been traumatized, raped, and trafficked before they'll be able to be referred to us for services. So what we're talking about today is real, and I really appreciate and thank the American Red Cross for bringing us together to discuss the challenges before us and the children that we want to protect and serve. We know children are not making this treacherous journey, this attempt to escape on the whim. And I want to appreciate Armando certainly for using his platform to bring light to this problem, Leslie for sharing her insights and representing the UN, and certainly Jessica for talking about the services that we share, and I look forward also to hearing from Geraldo. So I want to tell you today who we are, the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, share a recent success, and also offer a call to action for all of us. So our mission is to protect the rights and needs of persons in forced or voluntary migration worldwide, to advance fair and humane public policy, provide direct professional services, and promote the full participation of migrants in community life. So like the American Red Cross, our history of service extends over 100 years, and our network also extends across the country. We were the original network of international institutes. So our service to immigrants is deep, wide, and changing. Today, we're one of the largest refugee resettlement agencies. We cover half the country in service to foreign-born victims of human trafficking. And of course, we serve the unaccompanied children who are seeking safety at our border. In 2005, so as Armando mentioned, this is not a new problem. In 2005, we were the first national organization to organize pro bono legal services for the children that we had started to serve. So in those 10 years, we've served thousands in multiple ways. And as Leslie mentioned, in early 2012, when the numbers started to spike, we started to change our reaction. We traveled to El Salvador ourselves to understand the reasons for the migration and understand what was happening for those that were repatriated. And our notes from that trip I found, and they said at the time, most of the children were male, ages 15 to 17, but, quote, younger children were starting to appear. That year, we also hosted the First Ladies of Mexico, Honduras, and Guatemala at a conference here in DC. And as Jessica mentioned, she started looking differently at the way we provided post-release services for children. So we had pro bono services for legal representation, post-release care for children. And then in the past year, we've also added direct legal representation. So attorneys who are actually paid to do this work, and child advocates in 8 high-impact areas across the country. This is a new program that's funded by ORR, and what's important is that, this is now our government recognizing truly the need for children to have this representation. So it's very important. And in the first quarter of that program, 300 children within our purview have been matched with a paid attorney. So we will match 1,300 within the 12 months. We also participate in the Justice AmeriCorps, which again is using the AmeriCorps resources to have attorneys represent the children and improve the efficiency of the immigration court, also a big challenge. So for us, it's gratifying to see 10 years of advocacy begin to take hold, and yet going to the scope of the problem. The most recent numbers are that 32% of the children in immigration proceedings have legal representation. So there's still a gulf of children to be served. In the last quarter, about 800 children were referred to us for case management and post-release services. Of those, 41% were Honduran, 45% female, and a quarter of them are under the age of 14. So that just is our current referral caseload. The vast majority obviously have trauma and abuse histories as the reason for the referral, but here's the new thing: an increasing number have suicidal ideation. We continue to work with partners in the region. Some of you may be familiar with the Cartagena Declaration of Latin America and the Caribbean, 1984, which extended the definition of refugee to include persons fleeing widespread violence and massive violations of human rights and guarantee protection without having to establish a founded fear of persecution. So then last year, we participated with 19 others to produce Cartagena Plus 30, a 30-year review of where are we, what has changed, what are the advances and current challenges for international protection. One finding in particular in this report that is relevant to today's topic concerned violence, organized crime, and internal displacement. That the countries of Central America's Northern Triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras have experienced an increase in violence within the context of the growing power of criminal cartels and the so-called war on drugs. So echoing some of the concerns that Leslie mentioned. So of course, this reality is a push factor that we all recognize. And so, as it has been mentioned, last summer, everyone gets excited. There's lots of media attention. Congress is excited, and we're all talking about the problem, the crisis, the emergency. So at USCRI, we wanted to do something a little bit different. So we started talking about the solutions. And we proposed 6 solutions, which I have here. And we actually took this document to the office of every member of Congress, House and Senate, and handed it to them and said, we know you're excited, and here's some solutions for you to consider as you begin to look at a U.S. response. So also echoing the pen that we received today that says reconnecting families. So, you know, that was the focus for our solutions, of course, because we're talking about children. And one of our solutions has now been put into reality. And it was our solution number 3, in-country processing. So I just want to speak about that a minute because it's important to the history of who we are as immigrant and refugee advocates and what we need to do today. So the solution was to create an in-country opportunity for an interview so that children wouldn't have to make the treacherous journey. That's really what was concerning us so much. There's no reason any of us could defend for why a child would be put through that torment. And the procedure is one that the U.S. has used in the past. We've used it with Soviet Jews, with Vietnamese, with Cubans, again, so that people would avoid life-threatening escapes and dangerous journeys. So the program for Central American minors started December 1. As we sit here today, there are less than 10 applications. So it's a new opportunity, and there's some challenges. We are all concerned. How will children be protected while they wait for their interview or after they have their interview? How long will this take? Nobody knows. The first child has not yet been processed. And we have seen early legislation filed that already challenged the validity and the need for the program when only 10 children have even applied. So there are threats on our doorstep. So that brings me to our call to action. As I mentioned, we're the original network of international institutes. And at that time, immigrant work was immigrant work. No matter who was coming, they all needed the same thing. Everybody needed to learn English. Everybody needed to find a job. And the work of the institutes was to, attend to labor and housing rights or restrictions. And in fact, we published the first book called How to Become a Citizen of the United States. So we've been doing this for a long time. But then in 1980, with the Refugee Act in the United States, it changed the nature of the work because suddenly some immigrants, those called refugees, had a standard system of services and a different status that they entered with. And the services, while they have restrictions, and we will all argue that they're never enough, still they are funded and provided for a select few, 70,000 last year. On the other hand, the immigrant services, immigrant rights folks also continue to do their work, but without the standard set of funding and services. And in many places, those two types of work split. Some still provide both and always have, but many of the services are very separate. And so that's important with the new in-country processing program. So last year, another thing, I appreciate you mentioning the 68,000 unaccompanied children, 60,000 more accompanied. One thing that hasn't been mentioned too much for the Office of Refugee Resettlement, last year, the number of populations of individuals served who were not refugees was higher for the first time than the number of refugees served through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So here's the in-country processing program, and here's how it works. An immigrant in legal status, a Central American who's in the US, who has a child in their country of origin, they can apply for them at a refugee resettlement office. So if you don't know, that might mean a Somali, an Iraqi, a Burmese case manager will need to work with a Central American family to file the paper. Well, that's wonderful, except they probably don't really know that community. And meanwhile, the immigrant rights and immigrant legal service community, who of course is well acquainted with the Central American community and may want to access this right, might not have a regular connection to the Refugee Resettlement Office. So that's my call. All of us who are interested in serving immigrants, whether it's through refugee resettlement programs, immigrant legal services, those of us who are interested in social justice and protection for the children, now is the time for us to come together and make this new program as one avenue to reunite families and protect children. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacie. And now we want to thank Luis Gerardo Rivera for being so patient and waiting. And Luis Gerardo Rivera is the director of Casa Alianza. Muchas gracias por su paciencia, Luis. Adelante.
Bien, buenos días a todas y a todos. Primero que nada, quiero agradecer a la Cruz Roja Americana por habernos invitado, a nadie, para compartir en esta oportunidad. Sí.
Permiso. Vamos a tener traducción al mismo vez y queremos dar espacio. This panel is going to go a little bit over for translation, just to keep you aware. Si quieres estar al lado.
Bien, les decía, bueno, agradecer pues la oportunidad de participar y contarles un poco acerca del trabajo de Casa Alianza.
I want to thank you for this opportunity. I want to tell you about the Casa Alianza work.
Nosotros somos una filial en Honduras de Covenant House International.
We are an affiliate of Covenant House International in Honduras.
Con sede en Nueva York.
With its headquarters in New York.
Casa Alianza tiene 27 años de trabajar en Honduras.
Casa Alianza has been working in Honduras for about 27 years.
Con niñez en situación de vulnerabilidad y exclusión social.
With children who have been vulnerable and have been excluded from society.
Se dice, o nosotros asumimos de que prácticamente trabajamos en Honduras y en los demás países de la región porque estamos en Guatemala, Nicaragua y México.
It's assumed that we work in the different countries in the region because we're in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Honduras.
Prácticamente trabajamos con los niños que nadie quiere, por decirlo de alguna manera.
Basically, to say it a different way, we work with the children who nobody wants.
Desde hace unos 10 años más o menos venimos trabajando en el tema de niñas migrantes.
For about 10 years, we have been working with migrant children.
Principalmente en el apoyo, digamos, al Estado de Honduras en la recepción de los niños deportados.
Mainly providing support to Honduras, the reception of children that have been deported.
En vista de que se identificaron limitantes, bueno, en cuanto a la atención por parte del gobierno a estos niños y niñas que son deportados.
Given the fact that we identify some limitations to these children on the part of the government because these children were deported.
Por eso es que nosotros pensamos de que la crisis humanitaria, por decirlo de alguna manera, ha sido de alguna forma malinterpretada.
This is why we think that the humanitarian crisis has been misinterpreted in a way.
En vista de que esto ha sido una situación que durante décadas han enfrentado los niños, niñas y jóvenes en Honduras y en el Triángulo Norte de Centroamérica.
This is a situation that the children in Honduras, the minors and youth have been facing, and also in the North Triangle.
Hablando de necesidades de protección, nosotros identificamos que los niños y niñas están expuestos a una serie de situaciones.
Now, when it comes to the protection needs, we have identified that children, boys and girls, are facing different needs of protection.
Desde el momento que toman la decisión de salir de sus hogares.
From the moment that they make the decision to leave their homes.
Recibimos un niño de 14 años, hace unos 3 años, en Casa Alianza, que fue cooptado o fue secuestrado por una red de crimen organizado en México.
About 3 years ago, we received a boy who was kidnapped by a criminal organization.
Y fue obligado a practicar o a cometer actos delictivos, entre ellos sicariato, extorsión, en México.
And he was made to commit different crimes in Mexico, like being a hitman or in kidnappings, killings.
Uno de estas acciones que este niño fue obligado a, lo llevaron y le vendaron los ojos y le obligaron a disparar hacia otro niño. Él no supo al final si lo asesinó o no, pero este niño sufrió de trauma, sufrió de toda una serie de problemas a raíz de esa situación.
One of the things that he was made to do is that he was blindfolded and he was made to kill another child, to shoot at another child. He doesn't know if the other child died or not, but he definitely suffered from trauma and a series of other problems.
Aria and Wendy and Ashley, those are fabulous, and
luego vemos. Okay. A partir de ahí es que nosotros también identificamos necesidades de protección de los niños una vez que son detenidos en México y en Estados Unidos.
Now we have, starting from that point, we have identified different needs of protection for the children who are coming from into Mexico and the United States.
Una de las razones, si mirábamos un poco el incremento de los niños y niñas deportados desde México hacia Centroamérica, es obviamente el aumento o el reforzamiento del control migratorio en países como México y Guatemala.
So one of the reasons that we saw the rise in the numbers of deported children from Mexico to Central America was the increase in the control of the borders, Mexican borders.
Se ha identificado, por ejemplo, en la frontera sur de México, incremento de fuerzas militares.
In the southern border of Mexico, you have seen an increase of the military forces.
Y de igual forma en la frontera entre Guatemala y Honduras.
In the same way, in the border between Guatemala and Honduras.
Entonces vemos que estos esfuerzos, lejos de ser una respuesta en protección en términos de derechos de niños y niñas y de migrantes en general, son una respuesta represiva y de control migratorio.
So this response is not necessarily looking for the protection of the rights of these immigrants, but it's more of a repressive response in terms of control migration.
Vemos con preocupación, por ejemplo, en los centros de detención en México, en las estaciones migratorias, que hay niños menores de 18 años en estas estaciones migratorias, cuando la ley claramente dice de que no pueden estar niños menores de edad en estos centros de detención.
Now, some concerning situation in the Mexico Detention Center for immigrants, for example, is that we see a lot of minors, a lot of children under 18 years old, even though the lay specifically states that these children are not to be housed in those detention centers if they are under 18 years old.
Y prácticamente la opción de la deportación es la primera que se toma como acción una vez que son detenidos estos niños y niñas.
So once these children are detained, the first option that they go to is deportation. That is the first action taken.
Y no se está tomando en cuenta realmente las necesidades de estos niños y niñas en cuanto a protección internacional.
And the needs of these children or boys and girls regarding international protection are not being taken into account.
Aquí viene otro problema y es la debilidad en cuanto a la representación consular de Honduras, principalmente en la zona de Tapachula, en Chiapas.
Now, this brings me to another problem regarding the consular representation of Honduras in the Chiapas region, Mexico.
Y prácticamente nuestra representación consular hondureña se ha vuelto, por decirlo de una forma tramitadora de las deportaciones y no está cumpliendo realmente su papel de protección.
So to put it another way, the role that the consular representation is taking is one of processing deportations instead of focusing on the role that they really should have, which is the protection of their rights.
Existen limitaciones en cuanto a los análisis sociofamiliares de estos niños y niñas en sus comunidades de origen para determinar si hay condiciones para que estos niños retornen a sus hogares o si realmente pueden ser susceptibles a algún tipo de protección, llámese asilo, refugio u otros.
So now, I might have to ask you to repeat this. I want to be able to repeat it. We have not had a thorough analysis regarding this socio-familiar situations of the children in regards to going back to their countries or their homes in their countries. And the other options would be seeking asylum or refugee status.
Y es por eso que estos niños y niñas están regresando a sus contextos familiares de violencia, de limitado acceso a oportunidades y de riesgo incluso para sus propias vidas.
And this is why this is the context within these children are going back to their families in which they face situations of violence or limited opportunities because they lack other options.
Por otro lado, existen limitaciones en cuanto a la recepción de estos niños y niñas que son deportados.
We also have limitations
on the reception conditions of the children that are deported back to their home countries.
Thank you.
En vista de que el gobierno de Honduras no tiene la suficiente, digámoslo así, capacidad económica o también la capacidad o la voluntad política para asignar recursos necesarios.
Given the fact that the government of Honduras does not have the enough of economic capacity to receive these children, help these children.
O la voluntad de hacerlo.
Or the willingness to do it.
Porque, por ejemplo, se ve cómo se asignan presupuestos para defensa y seguridad.
Because, for example, you see how there is a budget for defense and security.
Y se reduce el presupuesto para atención a niñez en el país.
And the budget to bring relief to these children is reduced.
Entonces, al final no es una cuestión tanto de recursos, sino que de voluntad.
So, in the end, it's not a matter of resources, but of willingness.
Y eso es sumamente preocupante.
And this is highly concerning.
Por otro lado, se evidencian necesidades en cuanto a la reintegración familiar de estos niños y niñas en sus comunidades de origen.
On the other side, we have evidence of the need of family reintegration in these children's communities.
No existen programas o existen limitaciones en cuanto a programas de reinserción educativa de estos niños y niñas.
There are no programs in place, or there are limited programs that would address the reinsertion of these children in their communities.
Tampoco programas de protección en cuanto al tema de reducción de la violencia y el combate a la inseguridad en las comunidades.
And also, we don't have resources regarding that would address protection.
Niñas están siendo captados o tomados por las redes de crimen organizado, maras, pandillas y otros para cometer actos delictivos.
These children are being captured by different criminal organizations like the gangs or different other organizations in order for them to commit criminal acts.
Y cuando estos niños y niñas se niegan a participar en estas organizaciones, son asesinados.
And when these children do not want to participate or say no to participating in these acts, they are killed. They're murdered.
Entonces esa es una de las causas también que está motivando para que estos niños y niñas salgan o huyan del país buscando protección en otros lugares.
So these are some of the reasons as to why the children are looking for ways of trying to flee their countries to seek protection.
Por eso es que decimos de que el problema de la migración en Centroamérica, principalmente, y en Honduras particularmente,
This is why we say that the problem of migration in Central America and specifically in Honduras
es una situación estructural, son problemas o causas estructurales.
Has its origins in the structural level.
Que mientras no sean atendidas por los gobiernos, van a ser aún más los niños y niñas que van a estar llegando a las fronteras tanto de México como de Estados Unidos.
And that if the governments do not pay attention or focus on these problems, we will continue to see an increase of these children crossing the borders of Mexico and the United States.
Casa Alianza está involucrada en este momento en una investigación regional que incluye Estados Unidos, México, Guatemala, El Salvador y Honduras.
Now, Casa Alianza is right now conducting a study, an investigation at the regional level, including Mexico, the United States, Guatemala, and El Salvador.
Y dentro de los hallazgos preliminares podemos citar al menos 3 puntos que son preocupantes.
And within the preliminary findings, we can at least list 3 points that are very concerning.
El primero es la falta de atención a los problemas estructurales, como les decía anteriormente, que están causando la migración.
Number 1 would be the lack of the attention as to the causes at the structural level that are causing really migration.
En segundo lugar, se está priorizando el control migratorio a través de fuerzas militares y policiales en la región.
And number 2, priority is being given to the control by the military and by the police, the law enforcement, really at the regional level.
Lo que obviamente puede causar o puede implicar serias violaciones a los derechos de los niños y niñas migrantes y de los migrantes en general.
And the interpreter forgot to add at the end that that it would be that those control, the military control and law enforcement control is being given priority over the rights of these children. And number 3 would be the absence of programs of reintegration, adequate programs of reintegration that give a starting point. Although this is the phase in which the causes could be more accentuated. For example, the consequences of children against children, which increases the risks of assuming the transit of children.
He also said that the militarization of immigration control raises the risk of human rights abuses against these children. I think that's the takeaway.
Y también es una situación preocupante porque, por decirlo de alguna manera, estas políticas están siendo impulsadas justamente desde Washington.
And this is very concerning because these policies really are being motivated in Washington, D.C.
Ya sea de forma directa, digamos, financiando programas de México y Guatemala y Honduras.
Whether it be in a direct way, like financing programs in Mexico, Guatemala, and then South Honduras.
O indirectamente, por ejemplo, logística, entrenamiento de estas fuerzas especiales, de estas fuerzas militares que están actuando en estos países.
Or in an indirect fashion, which would be through logistics, the training of these special forces or military forces that are actors in these countries.
Entonces, en resumen, vemos que lejos de tener un panorama, digamos, por no ser pesimista, pero siendo realista, la situación tiende a agudizarse.
So to summarize, to give you a perspective, not trying to be pessimistic, but to be realistic, the situation is really worsening.
En vista de que los flujos de niños y niñas van en aumento.
Given the fact that the flow of children, of boys and girls, is really on the rise.
y las políticas siguen siendo, las políticas tienen un énfasis en la represión y no en la solución de los problemas estructurales.
And the policies really give emphasis to repression and not to the solution of the different structural problems.
Bueno, por el momento podríamos quedarnos por acá y cualquier pregunta o podemos ampliarlo, podemos hacer.
All right, so we'll leave you with that, and if there are any questions, if you want me to go into depth later on, I will answer any questions you have.
Y disculpas por la traducción.
Sorry about translation or anything. My English is not very good.
Gracias. So my app died, so I don't have your questions. So if anybody would like to ask questions. I wasn't too excited about those questions. I wonder if anybody. Well, there is one question, and I'd like to ask Luis. Luis, uno de los argumentos que los Estados Unidos ha hecho para eliminar o reducir el número de niños que toman este viaje peligroso es abriendo centros de procesamiento en los países, pero como dijo la compañera, solamente 10 niños han aplicado. ¿Usted cree que esos centros de procesamiento en realidad son la solución a las causas que esos niños se quieren ir del país en ese momento? Porque en ese momento los están amenazando. My question was, for those of you who don't speak Spanish, is that the U.S. government had posited the use of in-country processing centers as a way to reduce the number of children fleeing their country. My question to Luis is, does he really think this would work, given the fact that only 10 children have applied, and the fact that these children are leaving because they seem to feel an immediate threat against their lives? And so are they going to sit around and wait for some U.S. bureaucrat to process their application when the Mara guy around the corner is telling them, I'm going to kill them? Is that the mic that translates simultaneously? Yo creo que le dimos un micrófono que hace la traducción simultánea. Vamos a ver.
Okay. And I'll pass this around if people in the audience have questions.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Bueno, yo creo que puede ser una solución en tanto se acompañen de medidas inmediatas de protección también.
I think it could be a solution as long as you have immediate
protection.
Is it okay if I stand here? I'll just stand.
Tengo que practicar más inglés. Entonces, acompañadas, como les decía, de una política o de acciones de protección inmediata.
So coupled with a policy of immediate protection, like I said before.
Ahora, la limitante que tiene esto es que abarca nada más a los niños que tienen padres en Estados Unidos con algún estatus legal.
And the limitations that it has is that it only covers the children with parents who have a legal status within the country.
Y eso deja por fuera a una gran parte de niños y niñas que no pueden ser beneficiados por esa medida.
And this leaves or excludes a lot of children who cannot benefit by that measure.
Que considerándolo, no tengo los datos exactos, pero creo que son la mayoría.
And considering that, I don't have the exact data, but I think it's the majority of them.
Que no están cubiertos.
Que no están cubiertos por esa medida.
That are not covered by that measure.
Entonces, eso, por un lado es positivo, pero está limitado nada más. Por otra parte, es donde nosotros vemos de que se deben atacar realmente los problemas estructurales, que son responsabilidad eminentemente del país.
So that is positive in a way, but it's also limited, and we see that we have to see that that's the problems at the structural level, and the main responsibility of that is of the countries themselves.
Porque igual los procedimientos legales en este tipo de casos son largos, ¿no? Y ahí también tendría que buscarse algún mecanismo para agilizar este tipo de mecanismos.
So, and we see that the legal processes are extremely long, and we have to find or look for a mechanism that would speed them up.
Does anybody else care to respond to that?
I wanted to add just one bit in terms of the structural challenges, which I think Gerardo is spot on in terms of those. But it's a huge problem when a girl like the 15-year-old example I just gave you, fears sexual violence for not becoming a wife or girlfriend of gang members. It's an even larger problem when that girl cannot resort to her structural institutions of protection in her home country. So it's not so much that something is threatened, because I mean, we have criminal problems all over the United States, but the difference is, the structural piece of it, is that you can call the police, you can access protection in other ways. I mean, I know it's a lot more complex than the way I just simplified it, but it's not, it's very simple in Honduras. You know, it's impossible to access real protection from the threats that are felt so widespread by, unfortunately, an entire generation of young children.
There was a question there about a similarity, a parallel between child soldiers, forced recruitment of child soldiers, and forced recruitment of mareros. Se hizo la pregunta de que si había una similitud entre el reclutamiento de soldados infantiles y de sicarios y mareros infantiles. And that question is for everybody, but that was the question.
Yeah, and I would just actually say that the special rapporteur to the Secretary General has actually made that observation in that link.
I think he was the one asking.
And yeah, defines these children who are quasi basically working for a criminal organization that's like a military operation.
Anyone would care to ask questions?
If I could just add, I appreciate the mentioning of the in-country programs that have been established since December. There's actually hundreds of applications that are going to be interviewed and in the process. So it just started, and I'd just like to echo your call to action that we keep getting the word out. I think it's crucial, because this family reunification program is just one of many solutions. It's not the one and all, but we got to make sure everyone knows, and they can go and access and get the help with the resettlement agencies that are prepared to help all these people.
And also, probably important to mention that lawful status is defined pretty broadly, so it actually includes everything to like DAPA for a parent.
There's
so
one of 7
deferred,
statuses.
Yeah, deferred action to parents. So, yeah, so that's another positive. That means that hopefully that means there are more families that will be actually eligible.
But the question, and the reason that I harp on this is because the problem is that all of the experts that you quoted, and experts like Elizabeth Kennedy, who have interviewed the reason for children leaving, the children leave immediate threats to their safety. And given the fact that the structure in those countries don't exist to give those children that protection, then the question becomes, what is the reality, really, of having children who are expressly saying that they're leaving because they fear for their safety, then that they're going to sit around and wait for this process to go through? And I think that is the one question that nobody is answering in the U.S. government, because they can't.
Right, and it's even more challenging for children from El Salvador, because they're so small that it's rare that a child can actually relocate.
They know where you are. I was just reading before this thing died that the mareros will go into like the Western Union and the places where people are sending money, and they will get the lists of the people who are getting money and where they're getting that money from, with addresses and everything. And they're able to track you. So getting away is not easy.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely going back to the narrative of going from customer to commodity. I mean, they're very sophisticated. I mean, I would venture to say preying on the vulnerabilities of these children. And you know, one thing of reflection globally of the U.S. resettlement system is that it is very generous, very big, and very slow. You know, so when we need to do, when we need to fast track resettlement out, you know, we might turn to other countries that can facilitate it faster, less generous, but a bit faster. And so within all of this, you know, I guess we can talk about it in theory to design the best program, and I'm very confident that the U.S. government has put tons of thought into designing the program that is very recently launched. I think a lot of folks will learn through this process, but the crux of it is and we've put this one forward, is that, can the child wait for generous, big, and slow?
And how sophisticated is that child in navigating that process? Because that child is alone, or pretty much.
Right, so being able to access.
Even filling out a form. A lot of these children are functionally illiterate.
Right. And in other contexts, the whole equation of humanitarian evacuations, that's normal course of business for the UN refugee.
As somebody who's interviewed about 100 of these children, I think I have a clear idea of who your potential clients for these centers are.
Creo que algo que hay que sumar o agregar a lo que decía es los costos que implica estos procesos, y que para el caso de Honduras yo estaría bastante dudoso de que el gobierno asigne presupuestos para asesoría legal de estos niños y niñas.
Something that has to be added to this is the cost of these processes. Something that doubt the government of Honduras would be willing to do is to assign funds to these processes.
En vista de que no asignan recursos suficientes para la atención a los niños deportados, mucho menos que vayan a asignar recursos para defensa y acompañamiento legal.
Since they are not really assigning resources to these children that are being deported, they're not going to assign any funds for these children, for the defense of these children.
Y otro elemento que vale la pena apuntar es el caso de niños y jóvenes que han sido rechazados en las cortes de Estados Unidos y han sido deportados a Honduras, y que al llegar a Honduras, semanas o meses después, son asesinados.
And another element that we have to add is that element of children and youth who have been deported from the United States, then they are sent back to Honduras, and within a few weeks of arriving, they are murdered.
I interviewed the morgue director in San Pedro Sula, who told me about that. You can look it up at WAMU and hear his words. And in fact, the day that he was processing some children who had been recently returned and murdered, there was a massacre outside the San Pedro Sula morgue where over a dozen people were shot in front of the morgue. La masacre que hubo delante de la morgue. Yo estaba hablando con el director de la morgue horas después que eso había pasado. That's the situation you've got in those countries. One more question.
So if the process is done and applied for, and you keep saying that it takes a long time, you talk about years or
Nobody knows.
months?
9 to 12 months.
Well, okay, and if a child then leaves that has applied, would that application still be applicable for that child if they make it to the US? Sorry.
I don't have the answer to that, because if they came to the U.S., then they would presumably, they would either not present at all and live underground, or they would present and ask for protection, essentially seeking asylum. Whereas the initial application through in-country processing is setting up an opportunity for an interview for refugee status. So the end could be the same, but I don't know what would happen in the middle.
Because if you're talking about months and children that are being threatened, to me it's moot.
This is exactly our concern, and one thing I do want to say, since I brought this up today.
Yes, you did.
Yes, I did. But what I did say was that we had proposed 6 solutions, and this was one. In our choice was to have all 6 implemented, which would have, for example, every child who crossed, fine, you're in status. End of story. If your family is already in status, then you have derivative status, and get everybody out of the immigration court. So we had some other great ideas. This is the one that was picked up and is now a program.
Because it seems like they would need to apply and also have like a safe haven, kind of like when a mother is running away with her kids because of domestic violence, and there's a safe haven. It seems to be.
I invite you and Armando both to join our advocacy conversations.
I can't be an advocate,
because
but
this
the
is
White House has
exactly
heard
what we
about
talk
views
about.
on-
Yes, this is exactly our concern.
When I've been-
Precisely. Yes.
All right, well, thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Thanks to all of you for the work that you do. Obviously, there are a lot of questions about the protections and needs of children. whether they're in their country before they leave, as they transit, as they're held in detention, and then as they are ultimately released into this country. A lot of needs that are not being met. And hopefully we will all continue to do our bit to see that that doesn't happen. Muchas gracias. Nadia's taking over. She's got the mic.
Sorry. Just logistics. There's a lunch. I hope you'll join us for lunch. We'll open this divider up and you can socialize. Obviously, we're going to cut into lunch by going over, but there's still ample time. So please join us for lunch. Thanks.
So that's kind of like the border wall that you've got over there, right? On which side of the border are we
on? Here. Our live stream is going to be back after lunch at 1 p.m. El video regresará a la 1 de la tarde después del almuerzo.